All right. Good morning, everyone. If for some strange reason you've stumbled upon this and you don't already know who I am, my name is Dennis Misigoy. I'm a candidate for the U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida, running as a Libertarian. So, trying to give a shot over here, running one of these live streams, start connecting a little bit more and be able to express a little bit better some of the ideas that don't always quite get across in the normal social media sort of text-based communication. So if there's questions, I'll be happy to address anything, but I'll probably just get off and start giving a little bit of talking about a broad spectrum of topics, but one in particular just to start with because it touches pretty much everything, which is spending. You can tell a lot or find out a lot looking at how our government is spending money. There's been a number of things, in fact, in the last little bit in the news, in the last few days, and in the last few weeks, where I think is really interesting, and it kind of highlights part of the reason why I think it's so important that we need to cast aside the old two parties. Really need to break this cycle of the two parties controlling the government for ever and ever in every position of power because of what they do with that power. And in particular, I think spending is a good example of it. And I'll go back a couple of weeks and talk about something that just passed in the U.S. House. Now, the U.S. House, obviously I'm running for the U.S. Senate, but the most likely or the front runner for the Democratic nomination for this particular seat is Val Demings, who, like the overwhelming majority of Democrats in the U.S. House, voted a few weeks back to pass the NDAA, that's the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2022. For some inexplicable reason, we are increasing military spending in the year or in the aftermath of exiting Afghanistan, where you would think when we just left the longest war in American history, we're no longer trying to control this area. You would think, logically speaking, that if not at any time before, and with everything that's gone on for the last 20 years, that this would be a moment where we could finally begin to draw back a little bit of the absurd level of military spending. And if you're not familiar with it, I apologize, I don't have a chart handy here, but the U.S. spends more than about the next 7 to 10 countries combined. The U.S. military spending annual eclipses is well over 700 billion. Number 2 is China, which is less than 300 billion. So easily over double them, and everybody else, just about everybody else in the top 10 is a U.S. ally or close to it. I shouldn't say everybody, but it is so disproportionate and high, and a consequence again of bad policy, again being the policeman of the world, which creates a myriad of other problems. But the spending, and to have the excess spending, there really is no excuse for it. So this is just one aspect of it. There's a number of other things that went on in there, not necessarily related to spending. Is one that is the expansion of the draft, the military draft. We haven't experienced it in most of our lifetimes, but we all know a little bit about it. And one of the things that was passed in that NDAA was the expansion of the draft to women. And another nice little tidbit was an extra $1 billion going to in foreign aid, if you want to call it that, to pay for the Israel's Iron Dome program. So we're paying for national security of another country. No matter what you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the fact is we're rapidly approaching 29 trillion in debt. It's an insane number when you think about the fact that 20 years ago, we were less than 5 trillion in debt. Not that even less than 5 trillion, not that 5 trillion is even a trivial number, but to try to get a sense of how astronomical the numbers are and how it has been growing, it really is out of control. And to be so irresponsible, and again, to be giving away American tax dollars in exchange for not much, and to do it in this scenario. And again, it's something I find interesting because even a lot of people who are very left-leaning, who don't necessarily take issue with government spending exorbitant amounts, even they tend to recognize, and when we get into kind of arguments about it, sort of acknowledge that, hey, well, if I could say what government was going to spend on, I wouldn't be supporting these things. I think a lot of people across the whole spectrum, I, people across all, let me say, political ideologies would probably be pretty good with the idea of saying, hey, give me a form and I can check off what things I actually want my taxes to pay for. And I think if most people had that, a lot of things in government would not be funded. Stuff like example, like I was talking about in terms of foreign aid. Although this foreign aid, it's important to remember that foreign aid also doesn't usually deal with stuff like what you think of, like feeding hungry poor people around the world. It typically is, let's give money to another government to buy weapons from someone over here. So it's in a sense also sort of a subsidy for the weapons industry here. You can debate sort of the merits of that, but again, the question is, when you're nearing 29 trillion in debt, how responsible is it to give away money to prop up an industry that's not really hurting at this point? That's an important question, and if you don't think so, then you've got to start looking away from Republicans and Democrats, because again, they are overwhelmingly in support of this. And a lot of other things that government does that would never be funded if people actually had to consent to their money being spent on this stuff. A really great example would be some of the stuff that recently came out, or stuff that has been trickling out related to Dr. Fauci and the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, his department, the NIAID. We've not only had stuff kind of revealed in greater detail a little bit now about the grants that were given, which ended up at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And again, we may never have a smoking gun in terms of a connection between that and COVID, and there may not be a connection between that and COVID-19. But the fact that it's even on the table and has to be considered is something that really we need to have pause about and some reflection about, because this is not just that it's something that's happening, but it's something that's happening on our dime. It's happening because, at least in part, because we paid for it, or somebody paid for it with our money. So, and the question is, if you had the choice, would you have approved of it? We did have a ban on this on funding for gain of function research. That was, with the support of Fauci, done away with during the Trump years. So it's interesting to note, and it's something that I take real issue with, as we have also with the big reveal about all the experiments, really abhorrent stuff that was done with with beagles. Primarily, I think there might have been some other dog breeds involved, but in particular, the most sort of just out there, cruel, disturbing kind of stuff we have is the experiment that was noted. I believe it was conducted in Tunisia, but we were funding this, where puppies were drugged and their heads locked in cages so that sandflies could eat them alive. It is bizarre and cruel. You don't even have to be like a big animal lover. You don't have to be a big animal lover or animal rights person to just be appalled at this. And again, what's more is that you're paying for it. We're paying for it. So there's a lot of people in Congress now. I saw there was a bipartisan letter, a lot of people trying to demand answers, and they're wagging their finger. But really what we as the people in this country need to do is turn around, and we need to be looking at them and say, you guys gave the money for this. All of the funding for all these departments and all these grants and all these programs, it all goes to the Congress. They approve all this stuff. And if we take that step, then we need to take the next step and consider, how do we get there? Because I think if you could pin any one of these people down, again, I can't speak for them, but I think if you were actually able to put one of them on the spot and say, why did you approve this? Why did you vote for this spending that included these crazy programs and projects? My guess is that the answer that you're going to get from them is they didn't know, they trusted these guys, etc., etc., etc. Which speaks to the problem we have, which is that that we have the that there's this attitude in terms of how they go about legislating. The government is doing so many things, it's impossible for everyone to understand everything that's going on. So it's inconceivable for them to actually know this stuff. But there's an easy answer to that. If you're voting for something, you're spending money on something, and you don't know what it's going to, you just vote no. Okay? If you have a problem with it, you recognize there's a problem with it, you got to vote no. And that's the only way you're going to get back to having bills that have some kind of clarity. You shouldn't be approving anything you don't know, because this is the end result. Stuff like this, stuff like other covert actions and whatnot from our government. So this is the kind of stuff where we need to step up, where politicians need to be held accountable. Because even if they didn't know, if you're asleep at the wheel and you approve this stuff, that's no excuse. That's their responsibility as elected officials and stewards of our resources. So I got a comment over here from our friend Joe Hanush. So top 3 issues. First one, going back to what I mentioned with the NDAA, we need to bring the troops home, and we need to use what power we have from a legislative perspective. That's funding. The Pentagon shouldn't be getting funding increases. They've been very irresponsible stewards of the public resources that they've been given for a very, very long time. And obviously we don't trust their judgment as well when we look at how things went in Afghanistan and how things have gone elsewhere where we've seen interference. So there needs to be accountability in that sense. Another issue would be transparency overall. Going back to what I was just saying in terms of spending, I think simply put, if people had an understanding of what our government was doing in all these different cases, we would have a much better informed and a lot less likely for government to engage in all this kind of crazy stuff that we see. For example, well, I give it better to just talk about again the sort of top level principle is that the taxpayer has a right to know how their money's being spent. Going back to these crazy projects that we were talking about, and the voter, in order to hold elected officials accountable, needs to have clarity about what they're doing and everything they're voting for and what these agencies are doing. So one of those things that I would like to see, that I would push for, would be declassifying unredacted or releasing unredacted versions of classified documents within a short span of time. I'd say push it to be about 5 years. I think concerns about individual safety, people out in the field and things like that can be addressed if you're only releasing something after maybe 5 years, but you putting something out within a reasonable amount of time. We're not looking at government documents released 50 years later that tell us about some crazy projects that we're doing. We're getting lucky with some things right now, but I guarantee you there's a lot more that's hidden behind the scenes that we're not finding out about in a timely fashion that our government's engaged in. And just the simple fact of having that kind of transparency within a short amount of time, I think would not only help us be better informed, but I think it would also dissuade the folks in government from engaging in this kind of crazy stuff, because it'd be a lot easier to hold people accountable, obviously, when you know what they're doing and the kind of things that they're approving. Trying to think for another one. Monetary policy is another one. That needs to change, and there's a lot of things we can do. I'd like to see stuff where crypto can really get normalized. I think, though, it's hard to see how we would necessarily fit that in as legal tender without necessarily amending the Constitution, which gives Congress the right to coin money. However, Congress isn't really doing that. They've abdicated that responsibility to the Fed. So we want to audit the Fed. We want to end the Fed, and move on from there so that we can first get our money on solid ground. I'd like to actually, the idea of possibly proposing a competing currency, or again taking steps to allow people to use cryptocurrency or other alternatives, because the US dollar has been so mismanaged. I'm not sure it's salvageable. Term limits. Uh, my thoughts on term limits is term limits should be unnecessary. I think something around, I forget the number, I don't know if it was 27, 29, around there, states have already had um, term limits on their legislatures, but it hasn't yielded the sort of results that I think a lot of people are hoping that they would. It's just become sort of a rotating door, and what the it's been a little while since I've read on the subject, but what I've seen in terms of has just been that, well, because you have a little bit of uh, a little bit of less, you have people in the legislature with a little bit less experience, which means that which necessarily means they're going to have a little bit less of the competence to compete with the executive branch in terms of power. So it ends up sort of inadvertently expanding the power of the executive branch in those states. I think that would probably happen at the federal level as well. So I'm a little bit leery of it. I know we all are sort of, we view people who stay in Congress for decades and decades and decades in a very negative light. Obviously, we can look at our president, who was there for the better part of 4 decades as a senator before moving over to the executive branch. And there's plenty of people who've been in Congress just exorbitant amount of times for, like I said, decades and decades and decades. However, this goes back to their constituents. Again, if the constituents want to have somebody elected, if the constituents want to have somebody continue to represent them, me over here in Florida, I really shouldn't be the person to decide for the folks in California who are being represented by Nancy Pelosi, as awful as I may think she is. If they like her enough still, that they're going to keep still electing her, who am I to say that she shouldn't be the one representing them? They should be free to choose their representatives, and essentially we'll kind of think about it in those terms. I think people should be as free as possible to choose who's going to represent them, and I don't think term limits are necessarily going to solve the problem. So that's kind of my concern. And on the off chance where we actually get somebody really good, again, like so many of us, I go back to the Ron Paul days. Ron Paul was in, I don't know, like 10 terms in the U.S. House, split up with a big gap in the middle, but still. I would hate for him to be term limited out after like 2 or 3 terms and never be able to serve again, because even if he wasn't able to move the needle quite as much as we would have liked, I think he did do great work and sort of set an example for a lot of us to understand. Yeah. One thing, though, about saying the top issue, one thing I did read recently, or at least see a poll, was that actually the economy has come back to surpass COVID as the number one issue for at least a large proportion of people. I don't think any one issue took like an exorbitant amount. It was something like 16% said the economy was the biggest issue, 14% was COVID, and the rest was other stuff, but smaller portions. So I guess going back to that, though, the economy is a tremendous issue, and the question always is how do we get the economy working? The economy affects everyone, because the economy, and I think it's important for people to understand, the economy is not just about money. It's about the allocation of resources, for us to be as efficient as we can, and for everybody to improve the lives. We have to have sound economic policy, and sound economic policy, just like sound foreign policy and sound any kind of policy, is based on a recognition and respect for the individual rights, for people's individual rights, the individual rights to life, liberty, and property. If we uphold those, I think the evidence is overwhelming that is the path to peace and prosperity. We can eliminate or circumvent or avoid a massive number of issues that we're facing today by doing that, and certainly improve the quality of life for people across this country. I'm at about a good bit past the time I would kind of put down for this thing, so I'm gonna sign out for now. Gonna look at doing a couple more of these short live streams, see if we get this to be a regular thing, and Thank you to anybody who's come into view. Thanks, Joe, for the questions. And I'll talk to you guys again here and on other social media, I hope. But thank you.